Rain pressed against the window like a patient hand, tapping a slow rhythm as if urging me to listen. I shouldn't have come back to the house. Not after what happened here last winter. But unfinished things have a way of whispering through your dreams until you obey. The air felt heavier the moment I stepped inside, thick with the scent of damp wood and something else beneath it, something old. The journal wasn't supposed to be there. It wasn't supposed to exist at all. Not after the fire. Not after the police sealed the place. Not after I swore I would never set foot inside these walls again. Yet the moment I stepped into the hallway, I felt that familiar pull. The quiet insistence that something waited beneath the floorboards. The air shifted, as if the house exhaled in recognition. Every instinct told me to leave, but old fear has a way of blurring into obligation, and before I realized it, I was kneeling on the same cold wooden planks I had tried so hard to forget. The loose board didn't creak this time. It simply lifted under my fingertips, rising as though it had been expecting me. The hollow space beneath it breathed out a wave of cold that sliced through my jacket, settling deep in my bones. I reached inside, half expecting dust, mold, perhaps the remnants of the things we hid there long ago. But my fingers brushed against something smooth and strangely warm, as if it had been held recently, though no one had lived in this house for months. When I pulled it out, the dim hallway light shimmered across the object. A leather-bound journal, its cover darkened by time and something that might have been water, or sweat, or something far worse. I remembered hiding this journal. I remembered the shaking in my hands the night I shoved it into that hollow space, convinced that if I removed it from sight, the words inside would finally stop echoing in my head. But the journal looked different now. The leather felt softer, worn in places I did not remember touching. And there were scratches along the spine, deep, deliberate grooves as if someone had dragged their nails across the cover in a moment of desperation. When I opened it, dust did not rise. Instead, the pages seemed to rustle on their own, a slow, shivering flutter that reminded me of wings trapped in a cage. The first page, where the 9 lines had always been written in faded ink, looked darker now, as though the words had dug themselves deeper into the paper over time. The writing wasn't mine. It never had been. Yet I remembered copying them over and over, reciting them under my breath, because the house had made me believe I had to, that I was being watched, that the affirmations weren't suggestions or reminders but requirements for survival. The first line remained the same, though the loops of the letters were sharper, almost carved into the paper. You are not alone. I swallowed hard, tracing the indentations with a trembling finger. When I lifted my hand, a faint warmth remained on the page, like a heartbeat pulsing beneath the surface. The other lines, too, looked altered, some rewritten entirely, others smudged and rewritten again as though in agitation. I could almost imagine someone, or something, writing them in the dark while waiting for me to return. But what chilled me most was not the rewriting. It was the sense that the journal had been used recently. The pages near the back were still slightly damp, and when I pressed them together, they clung with a faint, sticky pull. As if someone had just turned the minutes before I arrived. As if someone had been reading the affirmations aloud in this empty house, reciting the same 9 lines that once kept me awake for nights on end, afraid of what would happen if I stopped. At first, I thought the changes were tricks of my memory, distortions born from exhaustion, fear, or the unsettling familiarity of being back inside a place that had once tried to bury me. But the longer I stared at the journal, the more unmistakable it became. The words were not just different, they were alive in a way ink shouldn't be. The first affirmation, the one that had always read, "You are not alone," now seemed bolder, as if it had been written with a heavier hand, gouged so deeply into the page that I could feel the ridges beneath my fingertips. But the second line, the one I remembered as a simple reassurance, had twisted into something else entirely. It now said, "It listens when you speak." The ink looked fresh, darker than the rest, and for a moment I thought it might still be wet. I blinked and looked again. The words didn't shift before my eyes, but something in the air changed, like the faintest tremor passing through the walls. I told myself it was my mind playing tricks, the house feeding on old fears. Yet when I flipped ahead a few pages, a cold certainty settled across my skin. Each affirmation, once soft and comforting, had darkened into warnings, commands, and cryptic statements that made my stomach knot. I hadn't written these. Nobody should have. They read like messages meant not to inspire but to bind. That night months ago, when I last fled this house, the journal was intact, unchanging, its affirmations frozen in the same faded ink they'd always been. Now the script seemed hurried, frantic, as if written by a trembling hand in the middle of the night. Some letters were uneven, slashed with a pressure that threatened to tear the paper. Others were so faint they looked whispered rather than written. I whispered the third line aloud, barely more than breath. The moment the words left my lips, a draft slid through the hallway, cold enough to shiver through my clothes. The candle flickered, though there was no open window. I slammed the journal shut, but the sound seemed swallowed by the house rather than echoing through it. The next morning, if the dim, colorless light creeping through the boarded windows could be called morning, I returned to the journal where I had left it on the table. Something compelled me, some tug deep in my chest, a mix of dread and curiosity that felt almost rehearsed. I opened it again, expecting the same twisted phrases. But the second line had changed, not just in tone or ink, but in its actual wording. It now read, "Adheres you even when you are silent." The handwriting was different too. The letters leaned at a sharper angle, as though someone else had picked up the pen in the middle of the night and overwritten the previous message. I flipped back and forth between the pages, searching for any sign I'd misremembered, imagined, or misunderstood. But the truth pressed against my mind with a force that made my breath quicken. The journal was rewriting itself. Not randomly, not chaotically, but intentionally, as if responding to my presence, my thoughts, my fear. Each alteration felt like a whisper meant specifically for me, a whisper that the house carried in its floorboards and walls. And with every shift in ink and meaning, a quiet dread took hold, the kind that doesn't come from what you see but from what watches you notice it. It began subtly, the way most dangerous things do, small disturbances that could be dismissed as imagination if you tried hard enough. A faint groan from the ceiling, a whisper of movement behind a closed door, a gentle sway of the curtains when the air was still and heavy. But the more time I spent in the house with the altered journal, the harder it became to pretend that these were coincidences. The house wasn't reacting to the storm outside or the shifting temperature. It was responding to the words on the pages and to the sound of my voice every time I dared to read one aloud. The floorboard beneath my feet would tremble ever so slightly when I turned a page, like an animal waking from a long, hungry sleep. The lights, those old, humming bulbs that had never worked properly, began flickering in slow, rhythmic patterns, as though matching the cadence of the affirmations. And the deeper I read into the journal, the more these patterns changed, becoming too deliberate to be dismissed. It was as if the house had a pulse now, a heartbeat thudding through timber and plaster, steady and patient. The first time I felt the vibrations in the walls, I froze. My breath caught somewhere between fear and disbelief. They weren't random. They came in 3 slow thuds that seemed to travel through the wood like footsteps, moving from the far end of the hallway toward me. Each thud echoed within the bones of the house, shaking loose old dust that drifted down like ash. I stepped back, clutching the journal to my chest. When I whispered the first affirmation, the vibrations stopped instantly, as if the house were holding its breath again, waiting. Somewhere behind me, a door clicked open. No breeze brushed past me. No hand turned the doorknob. It simply opened, slow and deliberate, the way a person might open a door when checking to see if someone is awake. I didn't dare move. The silence that followed was too deep, too perfect, wrapping around me like a warning. I forced myself to look at the journal again, at the ink that seemed darker in the dim light. The fifth affirmation, one that had always been about trusting yourself, had been replaced entirely. Now it read, "Do not ignore what moves in the quiet." A cold shiver crawled up my spine. The house was not only listening, it was speaking back in its own way. The walls had always been thick, but suddenly I could hear faint sounds within them, like scratching or whispering or the shifting of something too large to be an animal. Whenever my eyes lingered on the journal too long, the house seemed to react, the sounds growing louder, closer, almost impatient. Once, while tracing a line of text with my finger, I heard what could only be described as breathing. Slow, raspy inhales that matched the rise and fall of the candle flame beside me. When I snapped the journal shut, the breathing stopped so abruptly it left my ears ringing. The worst moment came when I read the sixth affirmation aloud. The house groaned, not from age, not from weather, but from a pressure inside its very structure. A low, resonant sound rippled through the floor, up the walls, across the ceiling, as if the entire building were stretching itself awake after years of slumber. Dust sifted down in a soft gray cloud. The hallway lights glowed brighter than they ever had, humming like a throat clearing before speech. And for the first time, I understood what the journal had been trying to warn me of for years. The house wasn't just reacting to my presence. It had been waiting for me to come back. I had always known something was wrong with the house. The way shadows stretched a little too far, the way whispers drifted through rooms with no source, the way silence felt thick enough to press against your skin. But I told myself the disappearances were just stories, the kind that cling to old houses like ivy. Rumors meant to keep children from wandering, myths to make sense of tragedies no one wanted to face. Yet the deeper I ventured into the rooms that hadn't been touched in years, the more I realized these weren't stories. They were warnings, and the journal was only a small part of something far older, far hungrier. It started in the storage room at the back of the house, a place that had always made me uneasy. I pushed open the warped door, expecting dust, covered boxes, and forgotten furniture. Instead, the room looked disturbingly lived in. A blanket lay crumpled in the corner, the fabric still bearing the faint imprint of a body. A cup sat on the floor beside it, the water inside cloudy, but not yet fully evaporated. Someone had been here recently, and not just passing through. They had been sleeping here, hiding in the stale dark, while the rest of the house groaned and listened. My heart pounded as I stepped forward. I noticed scratches on the walls, long, frantic lines that carved into the wood, overlapping until they formed chaotic clusters. But among them, I found something far more unsettling: words. Not carved with precision, but clawed into the surface as if someone was trying to leave a message before being dragged away. "Don't say the ninth," one read. Another, "It feeds on the last line." The deeper I looked, the more warnings I found, scattered across the walls like desperate confessions. Each one suggested the same thing: the affirmations weren't helpful mantras at all. They were a ritual that demanded obedience, a ritual that punished those who refused. In the corner of the room, half hidden beneath the blanket, I found a stack of old papers. They were brittle, yellowed with age, but the writing on them stopped my breath. Each page held the 9 affirmations, copied over and over again in different handwriting styles. Some neat, some shaking so violently the words barely formed. And on nearly every sheet, the 9th line had been scratched out violently, the paper torn through as if the writer couldn't bear to read it, let alone speak it. I gathered the pages, my hands trembling as I realized these were not the only remnants left behind. As I moved deeper into the house, I discovered more evidence: scattered clothes in a bedroom that no one had occupied for decades, a half-written letter left on a nightstand, a broken necklace still glinting in a shaft of weak light. These were pieces of lives abruptly abandoned, not by choice but by force. The dust around them was undisturbed, suggesting whoever left hadn't walked out. They had simply vanished, leaving their belongings behind like ghostly footprints. What unsettled me most was the pattern. Every missing person who had stayed in the house, every tenant, caretaker, wanderer seeking shelter, all left traces of the affirmations behind. And every cluster of belongings, every carved warning, every desperate scrap of writing pointed to the same moment of terror, the refusal to recite the ninth phrase. The moment the house took notice. The moment someone realized too late that the walls had teeth. As I stood there, clutching the evidence left by people the world had forgotten, the truth became undeniable. No one had left this house by choice. They hadn't walked away, hadn't run, hadn't escaped. They had been swallowed whole. And the journal I had found, my journal, was simply the next chapter in a pattern stretching back far longer than I had ever imagined. The ninth affirmation had always been the strangest, even before the words began to change on their own. I remember the original line, simple, bland, almost meaningless compared to the others. It was supposed to be about accepting the unknown, a vague, comforting sentiment that never settled right with me. But now, seeing how the journal twisted every line into something darker, I dreaded turning to the last page again. It felt like flipping open a mouth waiting to speak back. Still, the house seemed to lean into me as I stood there, as if urging me toward it, as if everything it had done so far was merely leading up to this single moment. A moment it had been biding its time for. A moment I was never meant to avoid. The ink forming the ninth line looked different from the others. It wasn't written, it was seared, as if burned into the page with something hot enough to blacken the fibers, but careful enough to keep the words intact. I touched it once, and the paper felt warmer than the rest, pulsing faintly beneath my fingertip. I snatched my hand away and told myself it was my imagination, but the heat lingered against my skin long after. When I finally forced myself to read it, the words hit me with a cold clarity that tightened my throat. Give it your voice so it can become whole. Not an affirmation, not guidance, a command, a demand, a ritualistic offering. The house responded the moment my eyes traced the letters. A deep thud echoed through the floorboards, followed by another, then another, slower and heavier than footsteps. The walls vibrated subtly, but not with the restless shifting I had felt before. This was different. This was anticipation. The air thickened, each breath becoming a struggle as though I was inhaling something alive that crawled into my lungs. The candle nearest me flickered violently, shrinking low as if smothered by an unseen hand before shooting upward into a narrow, trembling flame. Behind me, a whisper curled through the dark, soft and deliberate, too close to be anything but intentional. It didn't come from the walls this time. It came from the space just over my shoulder, brushing the back of my neck like cool breath. Say it, it murmured, not angry, not threatening, patient, expectant, as though it had been waiting years for this, as though it knew I had come back not to resist, but to surrender. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the journal, but the house didn't let me retreat far. The door behind me, which I had left open, slammed shut with a force that rattled the picture frames. Something moved in the hallway, slow, dragging, as if waking from a long rest. The shadows stretched under the doorframe, reaching inward like fingers testing the threshold. I clutched the journal tighter, my pulse hammering. The whisper came again, this time from everywhere at once, seeping through the walls, the floor, the ceiling, slipping between the cracks in my thoughts. Give it your voice. I realized then that the journal wasn't rewriting itself out of malice or madness. It was preparing me, grooming me. It had done the same to the others who vanished, reshaping the ninth line again and again until it became irresistible, until someone was weakened enough, frightened enough, desperate enough to obey. And the house, the thing that lived within it, the thing that fed on spoken words, needed the final phrase to complete something it had been building, piece by piece, voice by voice, across decades. All it needed now was mine.